Well, hello there, good people of the world. It's the Big Heavy, and one of the strange and somewhat surprising aspects of having this YouTube channel is that I occasionally get requests to review various products. There's a general rule in both YouTube and life: if somebody offers me something that has lasers, that is a hard yes. Which brings us to a little unboxing initial review of this lovely unit, which is the longer Ray 5 10-watt laser engraver / laser cutter. Now, I'm not somebody that's an expert in these sorts of things. I can't say I've woken up many mornings and said what I really need in my life is a laser engraver, but I do like the idea of being able to engrave little wood projects. I have some projects associated with my RV, and you'll see some content related to that coming up. We're having the ability to engrave aluminum panels, little wood decorations and that sort of thing. It'll be pretty cool. So I was kind of excited to get this. So what I want to do today is approach this from somebody that's never owned a laser engraver, doesn't know much about laser engraving, talk you through, how easy is this thing to assemble, how easy is it to get the software working, and ultimately how difficult is it to go from graphics file sitting on my laptop somewhere to being engraved in a piece of wood. So my understanding is that this puppy requires a little bit of assembly. So let's open her up and go through that assembly process and see what it takes to get this guy fired up. So far so good. Quick start guide right in the top. Let's see if it actually has some useful info. Forget that. We're real men. We don't read manuals. Let's take things out and see what it looks like. So a little preview of what's in the box. Looks like we have some extruded aluminum. I forget what they call this stuff. It's not C-channel because it's not spaced. Maybe this is C-channel since it's got the grooves, but some aluminum channel. Having watched a few videos about these things, essentially they're sort of like a 3D printer, but obviously only moving in 2 axes. We got what looks like a control panel down there, some mysterious stuff in an anti-static bag, and some other various parts. So I'll take everything out and we'll start putting her together. All right, so now we are officially unboxed, and a few things I noticed during the unboxing process. First off, everything looks nicely packaged. There's some, good quality foam, despite the outer box looking a little janky. It shipped in the outer box. Everything inside looks great. There was plenty of foam padding. The quality of the materials looks pretty decent. All the aluminum looks nice and is nicely manufactured. Nicely looks like it's anodized. One other thing I noticed, or a few other things I noticed along the way, they do give you one of these USB, I would call them printer cables. I'm not sure what the actual specification is, but with this funny, house-shaped end on one end and your typical USB on the other. This is probably not as common a cable as it used to be, so kudos to Longer for throwing one in the box so you don't end up with your super cool laser engraver and no means hook it up to your computer. So that was nice. This big anti-static bag, I assume this is actually the laser, just based on how it looks and the variety of warning labels on there. They also, as you saw, give you some cataract style glasses. So I assume this is so you can actually look at the laser without melting your retinas or whatnot. So that's a nice touch. And the other thing I noticed that was pretty cool, aside from the packaging and all that, is they do have various bags of screws. And if you can see on there, they kind of labeled them. This one says step 1 and 3. We've got step 4, step 5, step 6. So, nice they bagged up the screws that are relevant to each step and labeled these so, you're not searching around a giant bag full of mysterious screws that, sometimes in these assembly yourselves kind of things, you'll have a couple or 3 that look very similar. Some of the other bags with small parts don't have that labeling on them, but this is obviously a belt. This guy looks like some sort of USB dongle or something like that. And then we have this mysterious metal rod. Not sure what this guy does, but presumably that will all become obvious once we get going. And then we've got a little bag of tiny tools. And it looks like, let me open this up. Oh, cool. Yeah, it looks like they even give us a few little pieces of some sort of plywood. I don't know if this is balsa or birch or what, but some little things we can do some testing. And I actually ordered a bunch of pieces of wood and some pieces of aluminum to test things out, but nice, they give you something right off the bat. So we can give this puppy a try once we get going. So I will do a time-lapse kind of thing of the assembly. I assume that this will actually require reading the manual, and I'll go through that and let you know how that assembly process works, and you'll see the sped up version, obviously. All right, so we're in step one. So far the manual seems relatively recent. There is this little note in here, marked red is in the slot position. I don't know how the focus will work on these, but hopefully you can see that. And that was a little confusing to me. There's no red mark on these little corner pieces, but I think what they're referring to is there's a slot on the top that doesn't exist on the other side. So if you find yourself jumping into this and you get a little confused in that first step, that seems to be what they're looking for there. All right, so I have my first screw up. I got to step 4 where you need to attach these little mounting feet. You can see there's holes at the top of the mounting feet, and there's no holes in the front of my extrude aluminum. That's because I've got the longer logo facing me. It should be rotated so this front piece, which I'll kind of show you here, is at the top. So not a huge error, and I'm glad this is the subsequent step, not 10 steps down the line. So I'll unscrew these corner screws, change that direction, and be on my way. All right, so now this thing kind of sort of looks like a productive machine of some sort. I got the arm that moves that I assume will carry the laser at some point. Some motors on here. We're going to put some belts and whatnot in. To this point so far, I would rate the instructions kind of on the IKEA-ish scale, and I would rate the difficulty so far similarly on the IKEA-ish scale. You're kind of screwing stuff in. There's some subtle stuff that's in the instructions, and you'll put the wrong screw somewhere, as maybe you saw me do in the control panel, and then you'll realize you did it, and then you'll look in the instructions and see, oh, there was a little line there pointing to something that kind of highlighted that, but I didn't really understand at the time. So just go slow and kind of keep yourself patient, and so far so good. And let's finish this guy up, and then we'll get to seeing if we can engrave something. All right, so I'm on step 5, and in this step, you've got to put these little what they call T-shaped nuts. And it's this tiny little nut that essentially mashes down on this timing belt that's in the groove of this extruded aluminum here. And I watched the video. I'll save you having to scroll through, but Longer does have a pretty good quick start video. But basically what you got to do is take this little nut guy and drop him into this extruded aluminum track here, and then take your big Allen wrench that they give you, and you're going to kind of put it on top of this guy, and then you can push down and use him to sort of rotate this guy, and then he'll fit nicely in the track, and he'll mash down on that bit of timing belt and get him in there for you. So I goofed around with that for a little bit until realizing that the use of that larger Allen wrench was kind of the key to being successful with this T-nut step. All right, so ran into a little bit of a problem that I'm going to contact Longer customer support for. So I'll go through the regular channels, whatever those are in the manual, to see how they do. But we've got these 2 thumb screws that ultimately go in this bracket and attach the laser module through these little grooves here. Probably the simplest, more or less most self-explanatory step in installing this puppy, but the screw holes are not big enough for these screws. Gave it a good yank. You saw me doing a little video, so I can send that to Longer and see what they say. But that's going to pause our Longer laser engraver unboxing, and I'll report back once we get some resolution to this. So here we are about 2 weeks later. I reached out to Longer customer service and used their standard customer service email. I didn't go through any special channel or anything, and sent them a little video of my problem. They got back, I think within a matter of hours, so pretty decent customer service, and said, we'll send you a new part. And what they sent me was a new one of these, I think they called a sheet metal panel in the instructions, as well as 2 of the new thumb screws. And that ultimately fixed my problem. I don't know if this was misdrilled or if they sent the wrong, or if the original packaging had the wrong thumb screws. But in either case, that got me over my hump and got the laser assembly attached to the access on this thing. So should you run into that, I don't know if this was a one-off fluke or the classic kind of Friday build, but contact customer service. Seems like they'll set you up pretty quickly with a replacement. And it was pretty easy and self-explanatory to put on. What I did was ultimately loosen up the belt that goes across this top access, and then that let me loosen up the 3 wheels that go in this mounting plate, and ultimately remove the front plate, put the new one in, and all is well. And now we'll continue on with the assembly. All right, so at this point, there's this handy little cylinder that theoretically anyway, lets us make sure the laser is set to the correct height. So you kind of jam this guy in here, and then make sure he's up against this, which is slightly awkward to do if you're sitting in front of a laser, but not too bad. So let's get that guy leveled, straightened, and then we tighten the thumb screws. And at least theoretically, we should be ready to power this guy up. All right, we're at the moment of truth. We're going to plug this guy in and see how it works. All right, here's some whirring fans. Hopefully you can see that without too much glare. All right, so it looks like this puppy is on. And theoretically, there are some sample files in this little guy. He's kind of a little USB card reader. You can see the mini SD card in there. So I'm gonna put this in, find a file, and we'll do a test engrave and see how it works. All right, I've got my wildly cool glasses on. I'm going to select one of these random files, make sure I'm positioned accordingly, and then we'll fire this guy up. It looks like we've got a bird, a compass, and I don't know what basswood engraving is, but let's try, oh, logo. Let's try compass. And we'll frame this. I don't exactly know what that does. I'm hoping that kind of make sure we don't end up engraving this table. So let's confirm. Nope, and there we go. Oh. Yep, there is no action on the other axis because somebody forgot to plug that in. So I'm gonna turn this guy off, plug that in, and then we'll try this again. All right, we rebooted and plugged in the motor. Let's see. Now when we frame, that looks a little better. All right, let's see if we move that guy. We did manage to not only cut through this piece of wood, but leave a little mark on the table, which is suboptimal. So let's try that again. All right, let's let her roll. All right, so now that I've had some time to do some test engraves and to play with the longer laser engraver a little bit, I want to talk through in general, who is a laser engraver for? Should you go and look at this category? And if the answer is yes, more specifically, is the longer unit the right laser engraver for you? So let's start with that first question, and I want to give you a little bit of an unconventional take. I'm not a full-time woodworker. I don't do a ton of woodworking as a hobby. I am what you would call a general tinkerer, for lack of a better phrase. 1 week I may be doing a plumbing project in my home. Next week I may be, assembling a firearm or cleaning something or, working on a bicycle or something in the garage. A laser engraver didn't make immediate sense for me. I think that if you are a woodworker, there's a lot of possibilities here. A lot of people are doing interesting things with, putting maker's marks on their wood projects. using that laser capability to do really fine detailed work, produce interesting joints and novel types of dovetails and things like that you couldn't do easily without a precision tool like this. So if you are a woodworker, I think a laser engraver makes a lot of sense, with the general caveat that you have a workshop or you have somewhere where you can put it and a way to deal with the smoke that this thing produces. At the end of the day, it is a laser. It is essentially burning the wood or whatever material you're using to do the engraving and to do the cutting. So you need some sort of quality air handling system, or in my case, the poor man's version of that, which is open up the garage door, turn on your exercise fan, and blow the smoke out of the shop. The other, let's call it a no-brainer kind of scenario is if you're any kind of model builder. If you're making puzzles, if you're making models for a model railroad type deal, if you're making ornaments or crafts for friends, neighbors, Etsy, things that you want to sell, all that stuff, a laser engraver makes a lot of sense. I think the market for laser engraved stuff isn't as oversaturated as, say, 3D printed things. If you look on Etsy and other sites where people sell kind of homemade arts and crafts and things like this, I would guess it's going to start to get more saturated, but I don't think it'll hit a point like the 3D printer market where anyone and everyone can get a 3D printer, stick it in their apartment, and be off to the races. You do need a little space, if nothing else, to handle the smoke for something like this. Maybe you need a little more grasp of material science. I think the laser engraving is generally more design-oriented. If you're going to make an ornament, you need to make something that looks good. Just the fact that it's laser engraved is not going to cause people to buy it or something like that. Now, the more interesting scenario is for kind of the general hobbyist slash, tinkerer like myself, and maybe you fit into this category. And what I would suggest is that I think everyone in that space, if you're any kind of, more than very occasional tinkerer type of person, you want to have some kind of tool that gets you into, what in the 70s they called CAM, or computer aided machinery. But I think it's this new interesting category that's opening up to the general public and to kind of the general tinkerer of these machines where you can go and design something digitally and you kind of do, 70, 80% of the project in your computer, much like an industrial designer where you're, sitting in an office somewhere designing something for a manufacturing plant that may be thousands of miles away. But you're doing this design work, you're generating a file, you need some understanding of the manufacturing process, which in this case is, this nice little unit that sits on top of your workbench. And then you're ultimately feeding that design into the machine and building something at the end of the day. Probably if you don't have a 3D printer already, that's where I would start in the kind of computer-aided machinery or machine type, home manufacturing type of front, just because it's a little more compact, it's a little more common and easier. There's a lot more freely available designs that you can get started with. But the one major advantage that I think a laser engraver has over the 3D printer, assuming you have the space for ventilation and everything, is you're only working in mostly 2 dimensions. And I say mostly 2 dimensions because there is an element with engraving where you're etching below the surface and there is some depth to it, but it's not like 3D printing where you have to design something in 3D space. And at least for me, it took a while to wrap my brain around the whole process of creating a 3D object in what's fundamentally a 2D environment of your computer screen. I also think, at least for me, 3D printing leans a little more towards the engineering type domain. You're building things that are useful, that have some sort of practical application. You've got different mechanisms that need to fit together and integrate in 3D space. Whereas laser engraving is maybe a little more design or art focused. You're taking something and trying to make it pretty or interesting. So if you're somebody that's maybe more design oriented, maybe more artistically oriented, and something like Autodesk Fusion, which is kind of the premier application for doing 3-dimensional designs, makes your head explode. And frankly, my head kind of exploded the first few times I've used it and still does when I try and do something that's conceptually pretty simple. Something like a laser engraver might make a lot more sense because you can do most of your design work in a familiar tool. Most of the things I built that I tested, I used Adobe Illustrator. You can use Corel Draw. You can even use something like Paint or a pretty rudimentary drawing program. And then you bring it into a tool like Lightburn, where you kind of say for each of the elements in your design how you want the machine to react. Do you want it to turn up the laser? Do you want it to go faster or slower? So you can adjust the depth of your engraving or adjust your cutting based on those 2 settings. And that's a pretty easy way, I think, to get introduced to this idea of kind of home manufacturing. You've only got 2 parameters you need to worry about outside of your design, that's speed and power. And you're ultimately producing things that are kind of neat and a little more artistically oriented than maybe getting a 3D printer and producing desk organizers or something like that. So now let's talk a little more about laser engravers in general, and then let's get into the specifics of this longer Array 5 unit. Other than the ventilation thing, which I've mentioned pretty extensively, there's probably at least one accessory that I'd highly recommend that you get with your laser engraver. And that's some sort of, I think they call these cutting beds. It's essentially a mat that goes below the work you're working on, and it does a couple things for you. The first is fairly obvious in that it prevents you from cutting through your material and into whatever tabletop or whatnot that you have your laser engraver set up on. My very first test print, I managed to do that because I didn't line up the thing I was engraving well enough. And I have a nice little tiny mark in my table now, which thankfully it's sort of our janky project table, but gave my table a little bit of a souvenir for remembering my initial forays into laser engraving. The other thing it does is it has this kind of honeycomb shape, which I think allows the smoke to get through a little better, allows some air to ventilate and get under the piece that you're engraving or cutting. And it apparently reduces some of the soot and smoke accumulation that can change how your final finished product looks, since it gets some of that stuff away from the work and lets the fan that at least is in the longer unit kind of do its work and blow some of that funk out of the way and not have it sit on your work. The other thing you need that at least the longer unit comes with on its flash drive that they give you in the box, and you can also download over the web, that's frankly the path I would recommend since you can get the latest and greatest, is some sort of software. And as I mentioned before, most of these machines, even the commercial and industrial stuff, uses a file format called G-code. And you don't really need to worry too much about that, but the short version of that is it's essentially a file that gives this machine instructions. And they're pretty basic instructions. They tell the motor where to go. In this case, you got two motors. You got one on the X-axis, one on the Y-axis. They tell it how fast to move, and they tell it when to turn the laser on and off, and what power level to use in this case. So it's essentially sort of the step-by-step instructions for the machine. And these machines are effectively somewhat dumb. All they do is load that file, they read that, and where the expense and quality of the machine comes in is making sure it follows those instructions accurately. It moves the motors accurately and tracks the instructions that are in that file and does it well and consistently. But you need some software where you can actually take some useful, pretty, beautiful, or whatever design that you've made and turn it into that G-code set of instructions that the machine can follow. From my research, Lightburn is kind of the Cadillac of that software. You get a free 30-day trial when you download it off the website. There's also a free open source product out there, which I'll put a link to down below in the show notes, frankly, because I can't remember the name of it right now. But in all the research I did, Lightburn came out on top, and I think it's 50 or 60 bucks for a 1-year license. So, at the risk of frustrating myself with open source software, and that seemed to be the biggest complaint, that it was difficult and challenging and a bit frustrating to use, I found Lightburn to be, kind of on the edge of frustration, but not too bad. Wasn't wildly difficult to use. I'd recommend just going right for that. Use it for 30 days if you're not convinced, and you can go out and try that open source option. So with those few accessories out of the way, what did I think of the longer Array 5? And I'll caveat this by saying, as I mentioned before, Longer sent me the unit for free. I didn't pony up for this, so obviously there's some bias there. I'm going to reflect on something a bit differently that I didn't pay for versus something I did pay for, even though I try and do my best effort to imagine having plunked down the cash for this unit. And I will mention, Longer did reach out to me. They're having a Father's Day sale going on right now. I'll put links down to that in the show notes. So they do seem to put sales on these things relatively frequently, and the Father's Day deal does seem to be a pretty good one. So recommend, if you're interested, check out those links and we'll give you a few bucks off the unit. But with that in mind, in terms of the Longer unit itself, I'll break this into two chunks. So the first is the assembly process. I would rate the assembly process in terms of, the hardest piece of IKEA furniture you ever put together being a 10. I would give this 4 or 5. It was pretty straightforward and easy to put together. Most of the instructions were kind of pictorial, think IKEA. They also do give you a link to a video that's pretty nice. There were a couple steps that didn't quite make sense in the instruction manual. I jumped to that YouTube video. Hopefully you saw me talk through some of the assembly process, and I mentioned those stages that were a little bit goofy, but they were pretty easily clarified once I saw someone do the step in the video. They do give you all the tools. It's usually the typical set of Allen wrenches. There's nothing really special there, but I didn't need to use anything. I didn't find the tools so off-putting. I had to go and get good stuff from the shop. So that was nice. And I also, as mentioned, ran into that problem with the actual laser attaching to the mounting plate. I emailed Longer support. I used the regular old channel. I didn't go through my contact that sent me this unit because I wanted to see how they did. They got back to me literally within hours, and they sent a new mounting plate and they sent new mounting screws. As you saw me do, that was fairly straightforward to replace, and that ultimately solved the problem I had. They didn't charge me anything, they didn't give me any BS, I didn't have to send any serial numbers or do anything goofy, so longer support seems pretty solid, and I was pretty impressed with that aspect of the assembly process. For actual use, and again, understanding that I don't have anything to compare this with, it's engraved everything I've thrown at it pretty nicely. I was particularly impressed with the anodized aluminum, and I showed you that project I did for our RV for that solar disconnect. I love that ability to make little panels and make really nice professional looking custom labeling. If you were somebody that put together custom vehicles or boats or did a lot of RV work or something like that, that could be a huge application for these laser engravers. And I really didn't have any performance problems with the unit. I did run into a situation where when I had this unit in my house, aside from the smoke coming out, I had it on a table where we had direct sunlight coming in through a window, and it would set off the fire prevention system a few times. Basically, there's, I think, some sort of photosensor in the laser, since it seems to react adversely to light, that aims to detect if there's a fire on whatever material you're working on. And I think this is a relatively standard feature, and that sounds a little bit scary to have your thing catch on fire, but again, you've got a laser and you've got it cutting into flammable materials like wood, so obviously that's something you want to be aware of and prevent. And that flame detection thing kept going off, even to the point where, before the laser would turn on and start engraving, it was kind of going from its home point to go up and start to work on the piece that I was engraving, it would say flame detection. And as soon as I pulled the shade down, everything worked perfectly. So if you are getting that flame detection message, check and make sure there's not sun shining on the unit. It does seem to be sun related. I'm in my shop right now. I've got a whole pile of pretty bright fluorescent lights. As you can see, I don't have any studio lights on me. This is just kind of the ambient light in the shop. I had the garage open earlier, but there's no direct sunlight on the unit, and I haven't gotten any of those flame detection warnings since. I do like the unit has a nice clear control panel and display. There aren't a lot of buttons. There's not a lot of nonsense in there. When I first turned it on, I was a little bit overwhelmed. I was like, hey, there's only 3 options on this menu screen. But frankly, I think that's a benefit. Rather than having a bunch of nonsense in there or having this, give you a full bunch of flashy graphics, it's all business. Everything seems to be spelled correctly. Everything seems to work correctly. Everything follows a logical flow, and it's pretty obvious on how you get in here. You find a file that you want to engrave, and you're off to the races. Similarly, you can connect this machine directly to your laptop, which I did when I had this in the house, and you can burn directly from Lightburn. I found that super simple. The only 2 things I had to do there were change the communications port that the laptop was using, which is somewhat obvious. I think it defaults to Bluetooth. And then I had to change that setting from the burn speed from millimeters per second to millimeters per minute. And I talked about that a little bit before, but again, should you find yourself engraving and having things come out super light or seemingly not appear at all, even though the thing's moving around and the laser's blinking, that's probably the setting that you need to adjust. So if I was in the market for a laser engraver, I would definitely put the Longer on my shopping list. I have gone out and looked at some of the competitive units on Amazon. The Longer does seem to get great user reviews. The price point seems to be pretty reasonable compared to what else is out there. The build quality was quite nice. I found all the fasteners to be decent. I found all the aluminum parts to be well machined. The customer service was really great. Again, in a matter of minutes, literally, they responded to me and got me new parts that I need on the way without a lot of BS. So at this price point, this seems to be a pretty competitive offering. If you go up in price, it seems like they have units that have built-in enclosures, so they get rid of the smoke problems for you. They have some that have an auto alignment feature where it'll shoot some lasers at what you're working on and make sure that your design is lined up. That would be pretty neat, but that seems to add a pretty significant expense. So the Longer is kind of a nice entry point and way to get into laser engraving. So if you're in the market, check out the links below. Hopefully you see this video in time for that Father's Day sale, since it does seem to be a pretty good deal. And if you have any questions about laser engraving in general or this Longer unit in particular, throw them in the comments. Happy to answer them for you. I wish you, specifically happy engraving. In general, I would strongly suggest, if you're a tinkerer or mechanically or design-oriented kind of guy or gal, and you haven't experimented with something like a laser engraver, 3D printer, if you want to get really kooky, you can go into milling machines and digitally controlled routers and all this stuff where you can actually machine metal parts. But start with a laser engraver or 3D printer. I think is a lot more palatable if you haven't gone into that space. And if you've got a brain like me that seems to operate better in 2 dimensions than 3 dimensions, laser engraver can make a lot of sense. Again, with that caveat that you have somewhere you can put it, where you can fan the smoke outside or have some sort of ventilation setup. So happy Father's Day to my fellow fathers, and happy another day on the earth for all the rest of us. Big Heavy signing out, wishing you much peace.